So here's a nice one for advanced chemistry topics. How does it look when you titrate a weak base with a strong acid? Now, we don't do this a lot, and the reason we don't do this a lot is simple practicality. There are not a lot of weak bases out there, and it's kind of pointless to titrate a strong base with a strong acid. You don't see anything qualitatively interesting. But let's talk about what you expect to see. So again, I've got my strong base and I've got my weak base like I did in my previous video. So I'm just switching that I'm titrating with an acid versus a base this time. So how do the curves look? Well, remember before with the strong acid, we only had one inflection point, and that was at the equivalence point? Well, that's true here. We see an inflection point at the equivalence point because we go from base controlled to acid controlled in this case. And we get this shape. We start curvature down and switch to curvature up. So when we did the strong acid versus the strong base, we started out curvature up, and we finished up with curvature down, and we saw this inflection point because we changed who the excess reagent was. Same thing's true here, but instead of starting at curvature up, we start curvature down, and we start going curvature up when we pass the equivalence point. Basically, the titration curve of a strong base versus a strong acid is just the titration curve of a strong base versus a strong acid flipped along pH equals 7. So just flip them over in the previous video, look exactly the same. So how does this look for a weak base? Do we still see two inflection points? Well, yeah, we do. If we look at the weak base, we once again see an inflection point at the equivalence point. But here's the thing, whereas with the weak acid, the pH was greater than 7, with a weak base, the pH is going to be less than 7 because when we react away the weak base, we form a conjugate acid. As the name implies, it's acidic. So here for a weak base titration, we always finish at a pH less than 7. Now, we still have a midpoint that represents an inflection, and we still have our we still have our base corresponding to our concentration starting base. And we will get this curve. Now, for the weak acid, we started out curvature down. In this case, we start curvature up. Then we go curvature down, and then we see the inflection point at the equivalence point. But again, it's the same thing. So if you look at this, I told you with the strong base, we flipped around pH equals 7. Same thing's true of the weak base versus the weak acid. We flip it around pH 7. So when we had a weak acid, we were up here. With a weak base, we're beneath it. Where we were curvature down for the weak acid, now we're curvature up for the weak base. And where we were curvature up for the weak acid, now we are curvature down for the weak base. And that's the only qualitative differences between a weak base titration and a weak acid titration, and a strong base titration and a strong acid titration.